On his contributions on the international platform, Namibia and the world. We are now joined, and we're going to be speaking to a number of special guests that, of course, also focus on that area of international relations and diplomacy. And right now, I'm joined online by ambassadors to the European Union that will be joining us, of course, online. And right now here is Ambassador Neville Gertze, permanent representative to the United Nations, to just reflect on his role on multilateralism and the legacy that the president leaves behind at the United Nations. Remember his work dating back as far as 1976 with the establishment of UNIN. Ambassador Gertze, thank you so much for making time out to join us this morning.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you, albeit under sad circumstances.
Of course, it's quite a difficult one to start off with, but it's one of those questions that I have to ask. How did the news of the passing of the president reach you, and what were some of your immediate reactions at the mission?
Yes, I believe we were as shocked as everybody else were receiving the news last Saturday, midnight, around 5 p.m. in New York. We were aware that the president had come to America for treatment in Los Angeles, and I had been in touch with them with the delegation while they were there. But we had absolutely no inclination or inkling of indication that we would lose him that soon as we did. We were totally devastated. This is a man that had a vast network of friends in the United Nations and on the international stage. And the moment we received that sad news, we had to kick the ball in motion to inform the international community and to share our grief and our condolences with the family and the government back home.
Let's take a step back before we, of course, talk a professional business and just reflect on your personal relationship with the late head of state. What was your first encounter with Geingob, the man?
I have been walking a journey with the late president for the entire span of my career in the civil service since 1990, when President Geingob was Prime Minister and I joined the Foreign Ministry at that time. There was a very close relationship between the Foreign Minister, the late Theo Ben-Guritrap, and the Prime Minister at the time, working together on a daily basis. And as personal assistant to the then Foreign Minister, Theo Ben-Guritrap, I was often the messenger or the go-between between the Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister at the time. And over the years, we have been working closely throughout my diplomatic career, as the President had a very personal connection with multilateralism. In my view, President Geingob had multilateralism flowing in his blood. It was in his DNA because I believe he had already developed that in the late 60s when he arrived in New York and when he started to work in the Fourth Committee dealing with decolonization and got his exposure to the value of working together with others.
Is looking at, of course, starting back, and like you're saying, his multilateralism flows in his blood. We are reflecting back and starting off with the work done at UNIN in 1976. Talk to us about the relationship with the United Nations in particular. We know multilateralism is the overall body of thinking, but he seemed to have a very special relationship with UN in particular.
President Geingob is, as everybody has described him already this past week, was a man of the people, a man who could easily identify with people at every level of society. And when he made his arrival at the United Nations, I think it was in his character to make friends with people and to engage and network as wide as possible. And that is the nature of our work at the United Nations. It is establishing networks that you can build alliances with and that you can work with to achieve your objectives. But I've also reflected on President Geingob as I looked at reflections this last week on his love for so many things. For example, sports or culture. But I watched the other night a very moving clip where he was conducting a choir. And I believe that to me speaks to his ability and personal interest in wanting to work in a team. A choir cannot perform well if they are not connected, if they are not well tuned. And he played that role so well whenever he was on the international stage. He was able to meet and interact with his counterparts, but also with old friends who were junior ambassadors or maybe even junior officers over the years that he represented our country and in the fight for independence and our freedom. So I can only say that since he joined the United Nations as a staffer in 1972, that was the launching pad for him to get into the administration of the United Nations. And then moving on to head the United Nations Institute for Namibia in Zambia, I think that put him on the global stage where he was now able to mobilize support at all fronts, be it for education or be it for the military struggle that was going on. He used that position to develop long-term relationships with people around the world.
And as far as that is concerned, now we're looking at independent Namibia in 1990. Of course, before that, your relationship with the international organizations within multilateralism is completely different because you're petitioning, you're lobbying. Now is the advent of 1990. We now have to relook our foreign policy. We have to now develop a foreign policy as a state and not as a liberation struggle movement anymore. Right. Talk to me about particularly, and I want to bring that back now with a relationship with the late Dr. Theoben Kurirap, because we're talking about birds of a feather when we're talking about the development of Namibia's foreign policy and what we have today. Reflect a little bit on that relationship between the two and their shared or collective vision for the foreign policy of an independent Namibia in 1990.
Well, I should immediately say that at the beginning in 1990, when we started government, the Prime Minister had a different role. Of course, Dr. Geingob was then the Prime Minister in charge of the civil service and of government business in Parliament. And the role of taking care of Namibia's international relations then was primarily placed on the shoulders of the late Dr. Theoben Kurirap. But because of Dr. Geingob's past experience in the United Nations and on the global stage, the two of them had often exchanged ideas and could form the opinion before they could take it to Parliament, to Cabinet, and get approval of the colleagues on what policy direction Namibia will take on an issue. There was extensive exchange of ideas between these two leaders. I think it came from the time that they were a trio in the late 60s and the early 70s in New York with the late Idipo Amatenya, the late Theoben Kurirap, and Dr. Geingob having the shared responsibility to represent SWAPO and the cause of Namibia there. And I believe that as all three of them had such a strong passion for education and self-enrichment in terms of their knowledge, they developed excellent understanding of international relations, and they could complement each other very well on issues. Of course, we had our chief diplomat was Dr. Sam Nujoma at that time as president of Namibia, and all of them could relate and connect with the president on vision that the president had for the country. And this was their responsibility to develop and to promote this vision to the world out there. They did not see Namibia as a small country. they saw Namibia as a country that can make a contribution to international affairs globally.
And talking about that international affairs globally, of course, we have adopted from a legal standpoint a monist international legal order where if we ratify an international treaty, automatically the effect of that treaty is that it has to be domesticated. Correct. Talk to us about that position that you're taking. It's quite an important one from a legal standpoint for us as a country in light of our constitution and, of course, the fact that we've always been talking about being a child of international solidarity.
Right. Well, first of all, international relations is always based on domestic policy. You need to understand nationally what your objectives are and how they will fit into the international agenda globally, and how you can use the international stage to advance your national policy, your domestic policies. And this was why it was important for the late Dr. Geingob, our late president, to first look at the needs of Namibia. He was coming from a background of fighting for equality and fighting against oppression and rectifying the injustice that was done to our people in Namibia as a local policy became then also his guiding principle in fighting for others who were still fighting for their freedom on the global stage. We should bear in mind that there are today still 17 non-self-governing territories around the world. Dr. Geingob was an ardent advocate for those 17 self-governing territories to also be given their right to self-determination. And these agreements that we've signed over the years have all been influenced by this strong belief we have in solidarity, Pan-Africanism, and the advancement of us as developing countries collectively on the global stage, because he was always reminding us that we make up 80% of the world's population. Developing countries make up 80% of the world's population, and yet it is the 20% around the world that are in control of shaping policy, of governing, basic, so to say, the world. And he wanted to change that. He had committed his entire life to fight for equality and to help us put into place agreements and sign on to agreements that were advocating that objective. One of them I should single out is he made Namibia join the group of friends on middle income countries, because he believed that development, much as he respected the other two pillars of the United Nations, which is peace and security and human rights, he placed a very high premium on the pillar that deals with development. For only when we lift our country out of poverty and the developing world out of misery and poverty, hunger, and these challenges, will we be able to sit at the table, not on the menu, but at the table as equals.
Our approach, of course, if you look at it for foreign policy, while we are still a monist international order, was also to have an independent foreign policy that is non-aligned. Yeah. And many saying that position of being non-aligned is quite an important position for our foreign policy. Talk to us about that approach, because some scholars criticize and say, but there is nothing like being non-aligned. Everybody has interest within the global geopolitical order, and we surely should choose a side, particularly if you look at this Cold War between the global East and the global West, in that scramble for Africa, for lack of a better word.
Yes, we have to go back to the Bandung conference. We have to look at what took Namibia there. We were coming from a historical background of injustice that needed us to find like-minded countries, supporters who could support us. And at the time, the non-aligned movement was a natural home for us, because there was a shared history of exclusion, a shared history of underdevelopment and perhaps lack of development at the time. But of course, we were dealing at a time of the Cold War, and we had a different set of circumstances that we have today. At the time, the non-aligned movement strengthened Namibia's case, was the backbone for us to rely on for support. But I hear the concerns that that people have today about you need to take a position this way or the other. The art of diplomacy really has been so ingrained in Dr. Geingob's character that he never wanted to close a door if there was a possibility for a solution to be found. And he believed in the power of dialogue. He believed that rather than antagonize a situation, find the middle ground, find where is it possible for us to help those who are having a problem to come together. And if you were to find yourself choosing one side over the other, you would inevitably compromise the capability and the possibility of finding a mutually acceptable way out. Now, there are exceptions to the rule. Dr. Geingob and our government of Namibia have a principled stand.
And very strong positions on a number of contentious issues.
Yes. And those three I can highlight stem from a close identification to our own struggle. One is the people of Palestine. The other is the people of the Western Sahara. And the third is the economic blockade against Cuba. We have made an exception to our foreign policy to have a direct position in those three cases around the world. And these are allies who have been with us in the trenches, whom we had to rely on for solidarity and support. But more than that, it is a principle that was good for us that should also be good for them. And that's why we stand out in those three instances. In all other cases, we maintain a position of neutrality with the objective of influencing and helping to bridge the differences. He was a bridge builder, and that was the one thing that I take away from my 34-year-long journey with him, that he had always wanted to find how do we bring people together.
Talking about, of course, I mean, being non-aligned, but at the same time as well, sticking to certain principles and those contentious issues. Despite all of that, we know, of course, he was quite a revered statesman in terms of his contribution to the UN system at administrative and political level, but also sort of a senior head of state within the global geopolitical order. There was a special session of the UNGA to commemorate his passing. Talk to us about why that session was called together and what were some of the highlights of that commemoration.
Thank you. Well, I should say that the nation may have observed that last Wednesday we held a tribute ceremony in the General Assembly Hall. But the day before, on Tuesday, all member states' flags at the United Nations were lowered, and the United Nations flag was flown at half-mast for the entire duration of that day. That was the highest mark of solidarity, sympathy, and mourning with us that the international community had shared with Namibia last Tuesday, and then the event that we hosted in the General Assembly Hall last Wednesday. I should share with you that upon receiving the news of the sad passing of our late president, I reached out to the leadership of the United Nations, both the Office of the Secretary General and the Office of the President of the General Assembly. There is a standing arrangement that seating presidents do get honored in this way at the United Nations. However, it is often very difficult to get a mutually acceptable date when both the Secretary General and the President of the General Assembly would be available. Both of them immediately made arrangements and changes in their calendars to accommodate this event so soon. Normally it can take a week or two before such an event is held. And this is primarily because he had personal relationship with both leaders at the United Nations, but also with the branches of the United Nations, whether it is UNDP, whether it is UNAIDS, all these organizations, Dr. Geingob had personal connection with them. I should say that out of 193 member states of the United Nations, I have yet to figure out whom did not send us a message. For I was flooded with messages of solidarity. And looking at the statements that were delivered by regional representatives in the room, it was clear to me that Dr. Geingob was revered internationally, and he was recognized for the principal positions that he would espouse. This was for us a high mark of honor, but also because he had a history of 14 years of service in those corridors of the United Nations. And it felt to him as home when he was away in terms of his work.
Well, of course, there were certain addresses during the tribute and others that stood out, that we saw really make the rounds in the contemporary media and stirred up conversation here as well. Of course, tribute from the Secretary General himself. Particularly, of course, we also see from the Prime Minister of Barbados, Mia Mottley, particularly. And if you just look at particularly the content from the likes of Mia Mottley, looking at decolonial theory and the thinking of freedom, liberation, which many of them are still busy dealing with, trying to get themselves out from being territories of other countries, etc. Reflect a little bit on some of the key points that came out of those tributes.
Well, I think the general principle is that the name Hage Geingob was associated with the struggle for people's right to self-determination. This is an incomplete agenda item of the United Nations. There are still countries that have not achieved that. The second thing that stood out is the recognition that Dr. Geingob was one of those African leaders or world leaders who believed in the power of solidarity and who believed that in unity we have strength, that together, standing together, we can make the difference. But he was also revered and respected for the fact that he could speak truth to power, that he could call a spade a spade. And in our profession, in the diplomatic world, integrity is everything, that your word must mean something. And I believe that that is what resonated with the Secretary General and with Mia Mottley and with others who have spoken about his attributes. We believe that there was a generation of leaders in Africa who held this principle closer to their hearts than it may be the case today, because they had a common enemy to fight, a common enemy of colonialism, which is now no longer the primary objective. Today, Dr. Hage Geingob, the late President, His Excellency, had shifted focus to the economic independence that is still not achieved. And this is the area that is very close to the Secretary General's heart, because he too is a champion of the development pillar of the United Nations.
Well, in conclusion, I think just looking at the legacy as well, how do we, and I think I also want you to speak from a point of being, of course, like you said, a civil servant for the last 34 years, particularly within our foreign service. What is the best way to honor the legacy of Dr. Hage Geingob from the Foreign Service itself as you know it, and of course the rest of Namibia? How do you remember him?
Well, I will remember our late president as the chief advocate of teamwork. For him, we could spend hours every September in New York working on the statement that he will deliver. There may be people who think that there are professionals preparing this for the president. He was hands-on involved with the last comma, the last word in that statement, because he was in tune with the people who worked with him. And he wanted to give leadership in this process throughout his career. So I think it comes from his background as a football player. He knew the value of playing in a team. As I was mentioning earlier, his role in choir and music and everything else. He knew the value of teamwork. And I think our legacy, or the legacy that he leaves behind for us, would be to remain united, would be to build on this strong foundation that he has laid in advocating the spirit of unity, the spirit of teamwork, and advancing the objectives collectively for the benefit of the people as a whole. I will miss his personal touch when he was interacting with people. He had the ability to be friendly, to embrace people, to crack a joke at the right time, and to help soften the atmosphere before dealing with serious matters.
All right.
This is a trait that I would want to leave with future diplomats as well. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for making time out to join us, Ambassador. I'm sure we will be still engaging before you head back to New York, of course, running up to the funeral. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. My pleasure.
Well, of course, Ambassador Neville Gertze, there, permanent representative to the United Nations, speaking to us about Hage Geingob, the multilateralist, the internationalist, the diplomat, this morning as we continue with that focus. When we come